Okay, so I'm going to get started. My name is Brett Drake, and I'm a professor here at Washington University. And I'm going to be talking about racial disproportionality in child protective services with an emphasis on how we can use big data to consider this. So they were kind enough to give me a chair in data science, so I thought it was incumbent on me to sort of get some information out in that area. And it's also probably the most dramatic time in the child welfare field of the 32 years I've been in this field. So I thought it would be timely to address some of the key issues that are coming out right now. I am going to be making a mistake throughout the presentation and using the word I a lot, but this isn't really an I thing, this is an us thing, because the findings I'm going to be showing you just came out in a paper this month in the journal Child Maltreatment, and I was only one person on that team, so I want to recognize up front that several people at this school and several people in a number of other schools were also involved in this project, so this isn't just my work. So, a lot of the studies you may be used to seeing are estimates based on samples. This is about big data and literally the biggest data you can have, which is the data that captures pretty much everything. So throughout today's lecture, we're going to be talking about things that are like the census, things that get either everyone or nearly everyone. And so these are not estimates, these are true facts. We know how many people are reported to Child Protective Services because the states report, and we can tell you quite assuredly that if 1 out of 100 white kids are reported, then about 2 out of 100 black kids will be reported. Black kids report about twice the rate of white kids. And this has caught a lot of people's attention, and it's often described as overrepresentation. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of show you where a lot of people's heads are at right now. This is where your government's head is at. This is from the Children's Bureau, and it's a fairly recent publication. And I'd like you to read those two quotes. The child welfare field has moved from acknowledging the problem of systemic racial and ethnic disproportionality and disparity to formulating and implementing solutions. So, in their view, we have seen this, we have recognized it as a problem, and we're moving on to the fixing it stage. They also say, and the second quote is the quote that you'll see over and over and over again. Almost every paper dealing with this uses a version of that line. Racial disparities occur at nearly every major decision-making point along the child welfare continuum. If you're a history geek, you can trace this back to the NIST 3 of 1996. So you're like, okay, the government says that. Who else is saying stuff? Well, the American Bar Association is involved. They're quite concerned about this issue. This is probably one of the more interesting ones. The United Nations has gotten into the act. If you look at the bottom paragraph there, you'll see that a number of independent experts have suggested that the United States, in their terms, amend or repeal CAPTA, the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act, and the Adoption and Safe Families Act. That's kind of everything. There's a few other important pieces of legislation like MIPA and ICWA, but on the whole, those three pieces of legislation are most of child welfare policy in the United States. The reason I picked this article out of many articles was because of who the authors are. At the time this article was written, all three of these authors were deans of schools of social work. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is to show you pretty clearly, I think, that this is not just some fringe people off to the side making concerns known. This is a pretty mainstream concern. So this article is kind of dramatic in that it even questions sort of the moral validity of social work engaging with systems like Child Protective Services, because it is concerned that they are just so innately, irremediably toxic that maybe we shouldn't even be involved with them. The reason I'm showing you Dorothy's latest book is because, number one, she is probably the most important actor in this entire debate. And number two, I just wanted you to get a feeling for sort of the level of intensity that's present in this debate. So if you look at the table of contents over there, you can see that this is This is something that's carrying a lot of intensity and a lot of emotion with it. There's another book coming out later this year. You can't get it yet, but probably Amazon will be accepting pre-orders soon if you want to look at that book. So now we're going to stop talking about this issue completely, and we're going to talk about something else. Let's say you run a lead abatement service in St. Louis, and 50% of the families you serve are black families. And someone says, is that right? Is that correct? Is that good? Are you comfortable with that? So you pull out your phone and you Google the census, and you find out pretty quickly that 50% of the residents of the city of St. Louis are black, and you say, yeah, I'm good. 50% of the people in my service area are black, and 50% of the people I serve are black. I'm doing great. But if you went a little deeper, you might find a map like this that showed blood lead levels in the city of St. Louis. And for me, the almost pathetically sad thing about this is that I'm pretty sure that all of you know exactly what I'm going to show you on the right side of this screen, because we have all come to know so clearly that good things in our society are not equally distributed across races. So there are better parts of St. Louis to live in, and there are less good places to live in relative to lead levels, and it plays out very much the way you would expect. So you're not really doing well at all. You are providing services to the same percentage of black and white people in the city of St. Louis, but you're not providing services across races at a level consistent with the need for services. So you're failing. So the moral of the story is there's a difference between equality and equity. Equality is the idea that everyone gets the same, or perhaps that groups have the same. Equitable service provision is quite different. It's not that everyone gets the same. It's that the people who need something get the thing they need, or in the terms of the CDC, to be able to achieve optimal outcomes. So you've all seen this. We're going to be coming back to this several times, because really the whole point of this talk is trying to think about whether or not equality and equity are the better ways to look at the issue of racial disproportionality in child welfare. And towards the end, we're going to get to the justice issue. I'm coming back to this article repeatedly because I think it's a very nice, concise framing of the position held by what I consider to be the equality argument and its proponents. And I'm picking on Dr. Paluski not because I think he is a poor scientist, but because I think he's an excellent scientist. He's one of the luminaries in child maltreatment research. And I think what he's saying is consistent with what many people believe. And he also said it very clearly. So we're going to be coming back to this three times. Obviously, this is in a very strong journal. But here's the confusing part. We're not talking about one thing, we're talking about two things. Because Child Protective Services does not make referrals to itself. They are not like law enforcement. They do not cruise around neighborhoods. They receive calls through the hotline and then they act on them. So there are two very distinct sets of actors here. The first set of actors are the people who make the calls to CPS. The second set of actors are the people within CPS who make decisions about how people move through the system, and we must answer these questions separately. The first question is very hard to answer. The second question is very easy to answer. So you're going to have to bear with me on this first question because we're going to take sort of a creative way to do this. So one of the problems we all face in science is that your data and my data may not be the same. You may have a different sampling strategy, you may look at a different time frame, you may be in a different state, all number of things, any number of things may be different. So again, we're trying to minimize these problems by using universal data. Everything I will be talking to you about today is national in scope. Okay, we're looking at everyone using universal data. And there's only one choice. So we're going to take that choice, and that choice is using the NDCAN child maltreatment data file. Believe it or not, if you're a professor or a doctoral student here, you can get in touch with these people, and they will give you a de-identified file containing all of the child maltreatment hotline reports, more or less, for a given year. It goes back to about 2005. And if you're like, Brett, that's not good enough, I want to know about foster care, you can download this data set too, and you can link them together. Question 1, are black children reported at too high a rate? Well, how do we know what too high and too low are? Well, the way to know that would be to know how many kids are actually maltreated and how many kids are reported. It is practically, in a practical sense, it is impossible to know how many children are maltreated. For example, if a perpetrator maltreats a preverbal child and no one else sees it and it doesn't leave a mark, it is simply absolutely impossible that that will ever come out. There are lots of other examples I can give you. There is no way to know how many kids are actually maltreated. So we're gonna come in through a side door. We're not going to look at rates of known actual maltreatment. We're going to look at rates of known actual risk factors, because we can know that. We can know how many people are poor, and known objective outcomes. So if I can't show you how many children are actually being maltreated, I can show you a number of other negative child outcomes that are associated with maltreatment. Now, you may say, Brett, this entire approach is silly, I don't like it, that's fine. You're more than welcome to look at this that way. On the other hand, you might find it at least somewhat informative. So what's the y-axis here? The y-axis tells you at how much greater risk black children are than white children. So this is racism. This is the fact that in our society, black children and white children are not exposed to equal risks. So you can look at racism through a historic perspective or through a current actions perspective, but any way you look at it, it is simply not arguable that black children are not 3 times as likely to be poor as white kids. That's just where it is. Other risk indicators are also listed here. Why these risk indicators? Did we cherry pick them? Did we pick the ones that looked good and supported an argument we might want to make? No. What we did is we got a team of a lot of experts together, and we all tried to figure out the indicators that were both available and highly associated with child maltreatment, and those are the ones we were able to get. These come from CDC, other sources. Now, if there were no difference between the races, all these lines would be down at 1.0. That means 1-to-1, right? So we live in a time of fake news, right? So I'm going to join that and give you some fake data. That red line is fake. It is not real. I made that red line up. That red line shows you what I would expect if the rate of reporting to CPS were consistent with the disparities in rates of need indicators for blacks and whites. So that would be what I would expect to see if black kids were being reported at a rate consistent with their increased exposure to these risk factors. Remember all those screenshots I showed you early on? This is what I would expect to see if those screenshots were correct, if black people are being disproportionately reported to Child Protective Services at a level inconsistent with and higher than their exposure to risk factors. So now I'm going to show you the real data. This is what the actual data look like. And what you see is that the disproportionate reporting of black children to Child Protective Services, almost 2-to-1, is certainly above 1.0. It's not the same, but it's lower than what we would see in other indicators of risk for black families. And you may say, Brett, I'm not into risks. So, okay, here are some outcomes. These are outcomes experienced by white and black families. The y-axis is the same. It's the increased level of risk that black people in America face. And the particularly interesting one here, in my view, is the dark blue line, because that's the number of fatalities that Child Protective Services encounters. So black children are reported almost twice as often to CPS, but dead black children come to the attention of CPS 2 to 3 times as often as dead white children. So it's a greater disproportionality, and it's consistent with all those other negative outcomes. Low birth weight, infant mortality, accidental death is not too bad. That bottom blue line is about where you would want it to be. Okay, so I've shown you a bunch of numbers and graphs, and that's not nearly as important as the meaning we take from those numbers and graphs. So using an equality lens, where we want everyone to get the same level of service regardless of need, we still have black children being reported almost twice as often as white children. But using sorry, I think I said equality need, that was wrong. Equality is everyone gets the same regardless of need. I'm sorry. Equity, which is everyone gets what they would get consistent with their need, is really different, because it looks like CPS reports are not at a high level. It looks like, if anything, they might be at a low level. So from an equality perspective, we need to do exactly what many entities are currently doing. We need to try and drive down the number of black children reported to Child Protective Services if our goal is that they be reported at the same rate. But from an equity perspective, that's not what we want to see at all. We don't want to take away services from populations with higher need. In fact, what we probably want to do is see if we can get the services delivered at a rate proportionate to need. So driving those numbers down might be exactly the opposite of what we might want to do. Now, behind this is another whole problem. If you were to say to me, Brett, give me one sentence which describes to me something you've learned about child welfare in 30 years, I would say maybe the most important thing to understand about the child welfare system in the United States is we kind of don't have one. We have a child protective system where you can make a hotline call and someone can check that out. But we don't have the Federal Bureau of Supporting and Enriching Families, right? We don't have a general family support infrastructure in the United States. We have lots of fragmented things like SNAP and other things like that. But we don't have an entity charged with helping families. And in many ways, CPS has sort of become that system in a way, with this weird gating of having a child maltreatment report. So the critics of the current child welfare system are very vocal in saying, hey, we need to get services to families without there being a child maltreatment report. And I say, welcome aboard. Lots of people have been saying that for a very long time. Michael Wald from Stanford's been one of the leaders in this. Completely agree. We need lots better services within CPS, and we need lots better services outside CPS. And that is a serious underlying problem, no matter how you look at this. So that last question was kind of roundabout and indirect. This one isn't. So going back to here, we once again have the claim made that black children are more likely to be confirmed, brought to court, removed. That's easy to check. First of all, we're being told that at every point there's bias. So are black children substantiated more than white children? What do the national data say? Well, they're not. So notice the y-axis. The y-axis is very compressed, yes? So you'll see our whole range here goes from 15 to 30. So even though there's on that screen maybe a 5 or 6 inch difference between the lines at the end there, it's not much of a difference really, okay? So these lines are quite close together. So my take home looking at these lines is those lines are real close. Now, if you want to get particular, in the earlier time frame, black children were substantiated fractionally more than white children. And more recently, they're being substantiated a little less than white children. But that's what the raw substantiation percentage rate looks like. So I hear what you're saying. You're saying, Brett, this is the number 2 ranked school of social work in the country. Percentages, excuse me, we expect a little bit of statistical sophistication here. So we did some multivariate odds ratios that you can look at, and this controls for things like Was it sexual abuse or physical abuse or neglect? Was it who was the report source? How old is the kid? What's the gender of the kid? What's the same race income for the county the kid lives in? So we controlled for several things. And we found, like just about every study I've seen on this subject matter, that when you take those statistical controls into account, the rate at which black people are reported relative to whites drops even further. And when you think about it, it's fairly obvious that this would happen because, as we've seen before, black people in America face a lot more risks than white kids. So when you start to control those risks, numbers start to change a little bit. So once again, in recent history, either descriptively or using multivariates, black children are substantiated less than white children once they enter the system, not more than white children. Okay, what about foster care? The foster care data say, rather surprisingly, just exactly the same thing. Once again, notice how compressed the y-axis is here. These are not big differences. These are little differences. But in the past, black children were a little more likely to be going to foster care. Now they're a little less. And if you look at the odds ratios, again, they're a little below 1 for blacks, meaning they're a little less likely to be going into foster care. And when the multivariates come in, that number drops even further. So let's go back and really look at this carefully. Okay. Accepted for investigation. Notice there's no comment by me there. That's because one of the great blind spots in my field is we just don't know that much about the screen-outs. Now, there are reasons to believe the screen-out doesn't have a big impact relative to race, partly because if it were, you would expect different racial compositions relative to the screen-out rate in a state, and we don't see that. So we can't really talk about screen-in, screen-out, but we sure can talk about substantiation because we know that. And this claim that they are more likely to be confirmed is simply untrue. They are also not more likely to be removed from their families. That claim is untrue both at a bivariate and at a multivariate level. This is true. That is absolutely correct. Black children spend about 25% longer in foster care than white children, although it's kind of a complex issue because black children tend to come into the system later. There's other things going on, but they do spend longer in foster care. If the points in the process are subject to bias, it is not evidencing itself in those dynamics. Do I believe that you pick any state in America, there have been at least some occasions where bias has occurred at every stage of the system? Absolutely. Can I find evidence that it is driving the disproportionate overrepresentation of black kids? Not in these data. So, like I said, if you hear someone say bias exists at every stage in the process, and what you mean is this is a big system and there are going to be some bad actors doing some bad things because of racial bias, I believe that. But if the question we're asking is a little different, if the question is, does it look like bias is driving an over-substantiation of black children relative to white children? Well, it's hard to see how that's happening when there isn't an over-substantiation of black children compared to white children. This is the article that you can go read if you want to learn more about this and see all those pretty pictures for yourself. There's like 5 or 6 universities represented here. If you're familiar with the child welfare literature, a lot of those names are going to be familiar to you. So why does all this matter? Number one, before that even, if you want to make a change in the world, you need to know where to put your lever. You can't attack everything at once. You need to understand where the problem is so that you can fix the problem. So where might the problem be? If racism causes reporters to report blacks at too high a rate, then we need to work on those reporters. We need to change the reporting system, or we need to change the background or the training those people have or something. But our data don't suggest that black children are being overreported relative to risk or other negative outcomes. So I'm all for training, bring it, let's do it, but I don't think that application of leverage is going to change your disproportionate over-reporting of black children. Number two, if black children are substantiated or placed at higher rates within the CPS system, then clearly you need to change the CPS system. But again, we don't see that that's happening to begin with. So it's hard to see that that's a good place to put your change lever. Finally, if the report rate for black children is higher because it's not equally good to be black and white in America, either for historical or current racism reasons, then we've got another issue. Then the problem is more like the justice issue we looked at. It's the underlying unfairness and disproportionality in our society. Now, this gets confusing quick because CPS does not have the job of equalizing socioeconomic status across racial groups in the United States. They don't have the power or the resources to do that. On the other hand, they can look inside their own house. I'd like to suggest an idea which I'm going to call poverty-informed practice. Probably someone else came up with this already, but I'm going to temporarily take credit. So if you think of what trauma-informed practice is, it's taking trauma into account in everything you do. I know a lot of CPS agencies are doing this already, but to the degree they're not, this is a place they can make some moves. Anyone working with a poor population needs to ask themselves the question, how is poverty going to affect this person's ability to work with me and to benefit from the services I provide? If you require, for example, as part of a reunification plan that certain services be accessed, how will that affect a poor person differentially in terms of transportation needs, in terms of getting fired if they take time off work, in terms of being able to pay for those services? How can your agency at least not make the situation worse? So I would suggest that anything CPS can do along those lines would be good. There's also kind of an explosion in the last 10 years of some pretty good research, including some RTTs, that suggests that material support, financial support, may actually be very helpful in reducing child maltreatment rates. So I think that's a pretty hopeful area. Sorry, back to the boxes. I think equality as a policy goal, i.e. having black children and white children reported at the same rate, is scientifically and morally indefensible. I think like so many other things in social work, we need to start using an equity lens. We need to start saying, are the people who need help and protection getting the help and protection? Finally, when will this all go away? This is not going to go away until the whole thing goes away, until we have a society where we see different groups enjoying similar levels of resources and advantages. And I'll go further. I'll say it should not go away until we reach that point, because until we reach that point, one group is going to need the help more than the other group and should be getting the help more than the other group. Okay, so since the 1960s, poverty fatigue has been real, and we're like, okay, Brett's saying fix poverty, I'm going to sleep now, okay, bye-bye. It's paralyzing and scary. But if you get on I-55 and drive north for about 4 hours, you can go talk to these people, and they can say something that might make you feel a little bit less paralyzed. I'm going to read this abstract word for a couple reasons. Number one, I think it's really informative. Number two, man, this is a master class on how to fit an entire paper into like 150 words. So in this study, Lonnie Berger and Pack and some other people used microsimulation methods to estimate reduction in CPS involvement resulting from the implementation of a few achievable, not paralyzing things, which included introducing a child allowance, not crazy, expanding the EITC, not crazy, expanding SNAP, not crazy, and the federal minimum wage. And a lot of states already have minimum wages much higher than the federal minimum wage. So those are not unachievable crazy things. They found that if you do that, you might reduce child maltreatment reports by 20% annually. That's about 800,000 accepted cases annually, about 1.4 million reports annually. But here's the part relevant to us. They estimate a 30% reduction in investigations for black children, a 25% reduction for Hispanic children, and a 13% reduction for white children. In other words, if you provide some help in the poverty domain, then the populations who are most impacted by poverty are going to benefit more. And so this is one way to think about reducing racial disproportionality in child protective services. And I see this as sort of dealing with the root of the problem rather than dealing with sort of the downstream manifestations of the problem. And I think this is a good way to go. But Brett, I've heard any number of lived experiences from people or newspaper articles which tell me that Child Protective Services is just staggeringly and defensively racist, or at least were in those cases. Those are not trivial incidents. Those are things which we need to come down on like a ton of bricks. Those are things that we need to make sure don't happen. It doesn't look like things like that are driving racial disproportionality as a whole, but that doesn't make them any more morally acceptable when they do occur, even in isolation. So I am not saying don't pay attention to those things. Number two, if you really want to fix this problem, then probably we need to think about the underlying problems, which again get back to it is just not the same being black and white in America. And we need to fund interventions both within Child Protective Services and before you come to Child Protective Services. So that's really what I had to say, and I'd be happy to hear any questions anybody might have. Fred.
Thank you very, very much. Oh, there's a microphone. Thank you so much. How 5 minutes left? Oh, yeah. We don't use microphone. So thank you so much. Really, this was very educative to me. I don't do domestic work, and I'm just learning a lot about this. And the questions are going to be very for me, I'm going to ask questions about methods, because I don't know the area very well,
Sure.
But it was very compelling. And thank you so much. So one of the studies that you indicated accounts for, so if you use all these income support programs, you can account for 20%. That's what you indicated, 20%, which really means there is another 80% which is not explained by income support. So do we know what are the other reasons within the 80%? Because 20% is good, but I think that crafting the entire narrative around poverty is the most important, and yet we are only explaining not even 1/3 of the issue. That, so that raises a question for me. Then the other question I have for you is, so here we are comparing black kids to white kids, and we are looking at that. Do we look at within group? I'm sure you guys have done this. Have we looked at within group, the black, to the extent that if you are higher on the ladder and you are black and you are high income, how do those compare to, maltreatment or reporting or stuff like that? I don't know whether that makes sense, but did we look to within group? And then the last question I'll ask is, I know that in the US you can also look at poverty. This is census data, which is excellent, but could we also look at these states? Are there some states which are overrepresented in this data, that, the Mississippis and all that, they have lots of black kids, but also they are extremely poor? So those are, I think, the three methodological questions, but the presentation was good for me.
So the first question you asked, I went to Lonnie and I asked him exactly the same question, word for word. And what Lonnie said was, Brett, dude, these are small assaults on poverty. This is not eradication of poverty. So if you come at it from a different angle, if we're able to get rid of poverty, there's no way to estimate that really accurately, but from all the studies I've looked at, I would estimate that you would drop child maltreatment by 60 to 80%. And you may say, Brett, that sounds crazy. But if you look at benchmark studies like the national incidence studies, you start to see estimates that maltreatment, for example, is 5 times as common among poor families as among wealthy families. If you look at studies like NSCAW, you begin to see that well over half of children who receive child welfare services are at the poverty line. So this is only nibbling at the edges of the problem to get this 20, 30% reduction. If, hypothetically, if we were able to wipe out poverty, it would be much more than a 20 or 30% reduction. Well, this is only modeling the effects of SNAP, EITC, a minimum wage, and a child allowance. This is not doing like a universal basic income to raise every family to 50K a year. These are small nibbles at poverty, not a shark hitting poverty. These are like goldfish hitting poverty. So the second question, I hope I get these in the right order, is the within group question, and at the risk of teasing a future article that we're working on now, yeah, we can invite you in. No, we stole this idea from Fred. No, remember how in Harry Potter, the Deathly Hallows symbol kept popping up, and they make a big point of that? There's a similar symbol or image in child welfare that keeps popping up. If you look at the association between poverty and maltreatment for white kids, it looks like this. If you look at the association for black kids, it looks like this. In other words, if you're looking at the very poorest people, then white people are actually more likely to come to the attention of CPS than black people. But if you're looking at the wealthier people, then black people are more likely than white people to come to the attention of Child Protective Services. So this has been found in the United States, it's been found in the United Kingdom, it's been found in Child Protective Services reports, it's been found in self-reports, it's been found a lot of different ways. So there are different theories for why this might be happening, and we're not quite sure why. I have a couple that I could throw at you if you'd like, but yeah, it does look like there is, once you disaggregate by race and look at the poverty slopes, they do look different. And then you had a third question, and I've forgotten it.
Third question, since I spoke on races, I was thinking probably, but I was looking at states.
Oh, states, yes. States can be nightmarishly confusing because there's some weird stuff going on. One of the weird things that Brenda Smith has found, who's an awesome researcher, is that it looks like black rural populations behave rather differently than black urban populations. And this gets confusing quick because more or less in the United States, black rural populations only exist in the Deep South. So now you've got this regional effect that looks like an urban-rural effect that isn't, and then you've got other weird stuff going on. For example, if you look at some of the north-central states, you'll see that they seem to have very high disproportionality rates. And you look at how the black people are doing in those states, and they look very much like black people across the rest of the country. And you say, what's going on? Well, that's not the issue. The issue is that a lot of the white people in those states are doing better than white people in other parts of the country. So the relative difference is greater and the disproportionality is greater. So there's lots of really interesting state-by-state sort of subtle effects that you only sort of get into after you've been sort of getting your hands dirty in this work for a while.
So in your analysis that you gave us, I didn't hear you putting in dummies for states.
The multivariate did control for state effects, but no, we're not breaking it down by state. And in a way, it's very profitable to do that because you get a lot more understanding of what's going on, a lot more learning of what's going on. But of course, every time one state goes in this direction from the mean, another one goes in that direction from the mean, right? So anytime you see an effect that you're looking for in one state up here, the opposite's happening somewhere else. So yeah, interesting. Really good questions. Other questions? Joe.
Question or observation or I don't know, but I've tried to relate it to some of the stuff that I do. Like if I had a population that was exposed, for example, asbestos at a disproportionately high rate, and exposed to cigarette smoking at a disproportionately high rate. And then I didn't see reported lung cancer at a rate that is commensurate with that known risk. I would be deeply concerned that we're missing lung cancer cases. That would be,
Right.
I would say, we aren't doing our job.
Right.
Like, this is fundamentally, we have a disparity in screening or disparity in treatment. And what I'm gathering from you is, just because I want to make sure I understand, like, these risk factors are there in certain populations at a disproportional rate. And that's, you could talk about the societal reasons for all that happening, and we can go, and which you did, but at the bottom line, those risk factors are present. And,
Right.
and we're under-reporting that. So I can imagine, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but how frustrating it must be to see people intimate otherwise.
I am extremely concerned that the drive to push down reporting of black children who already may be underserved is going to get black children killed and is going to result in exactly the opposite social justice effect that the often well-meaning people behind these ideas are trying to achieve. I'm absolutely terrified about that.
As far as those other studies that were from, like you said, really wonderful scientists that do show or do report that they see bias at every level of CPS, are they looking at different data, or like is there?
So the thing to understand about the abolition movement is that it's a movement, and it is self-identified as such. And it is functioning as a movement does. They are picking particular studies that support their perspective, highlighting those studies, and using those as levers for policy. So, for example, I've written a lot in this area. One of my studies is one of the studies that they most frequently cite. Possibly the single study they most frequently cite. And that was a study that I did showing that perhaps more than half of all black children will be contacted by Child Protective Services before they turn 18. There was political value in them advancing that finding, and they advance it a lot. They haven't been quite so generous in citing the dozen or so other articles I've written on this that stand directly against the things they have to say. And so I would suggest that as a movement, they are doing what you would expect, and they are advancing their political agenda. And I would not take their conclusions as being the result of anything approaching a neutral scientific review.
And then a follow-up question. Either from the abolitionist side of things or from any research you've seen, are there any alternative models to CPS that seem to show some promise?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And certainly there's an alternative model within CPS, which is very much an incremental change rather than a massive change. People are trying to move to something called alternative response, which is meant to be sort of less intrusive than a traditional response. The idea is that you match a sort of more supportive suite of services to a series of less potentially terrifying cases. And so that's getting some purchase, and there's some evidence that says it doesn't do much. There's some recent evidence that says maybe it is helpful. So within CPS, that's one thing that people are doing. Certainly any kind of front, I'd like to see families help before they come to the attention of Child Protective Services. I think Melissa actually had something to say on this.
So I was just going to follow up. There is a very small portion of alternative response that is dealing with screen-out cases in a couple of regions that are showing some good results, but they're not getting replicated. And most of those require a significant amount of collaboration with community agencies and some infusion of dollars. There's some experiments with universal basic income and some other places that have shown some, small drops when you do it at the aggregate level. We will be seeing COVID family, the family payments. So we'll be seeing results from that soon, but it took a while for people to put those data together. And then the last thing I'll say is that in about 2010, we started really investing in home visitation, but those models were a little late to the game around issues of poverty and IPV and other things. They are now retooling around those things. So I think there's a lot of things happening at once that have promise. It's just it's not going to descend as the model.
And if you want more information about one of the longer standing programs in that area, you can Google PSOP and you'll find some information about that.
Regarding the Dean study, the first one. I didn't realize, is this a data-driven study or is this, literature review? Because I didn't hear the critique of that study, and probably it goes back.
Sorry, which study?
The Dean, the Teasley, Abrams, and...
Oh, no, that's a commentary. Most of what is written by the abolitionist movement is commentary.
Okay. So is there data, is there a data-driven study?
So,
and I don't know these terms, abolitionist, whatever, but is there a data-driven study that makes their case and which we used it, meaningful rigor? And this is not to discard, commentaries and all that stuff, but I just wanted to think about it as a scientist.
Yeah, so if you really look for the empirical roots of the claims they make, there are a few kind of outlier studies that they tend to feature over and over and over again. One of them was actually a rather ingenious study on foster care by someone named Doyle that was done in 2008. Another one was a 2011 study done by Alan Detlef. But again, I would say that you're seeing a tremendous focus on studies which have findings contrary to the majority of the literature. And they're simply happy to repeat these over and over again because that is what they aim to do. They aim to influence policy by using the best information that they can, and they're highlighting those few studies that support their perspective. This is very political.
Right, thank you for this. It's very interesting. I'm most intrigued by your justice line, where the fence changed its characteristics. So would you please tell me, do we now assume that justice and equity are the same, and so there doesn't need to be a justice and equity? And what's the difference? What advantage now has the see-through fence brought to the forefront?
Good. So in my now I've seen justice interpreted several different ways, so this may not be the way you've heard it. But in my view, equity is the 63106 zip code. That way, couple 3 miles, is got an average income of like $20,000 per household per year and is 96% black. Okay? So an equity approach would be recognizing that you've got a bunch of American citizens there who are in a world of hurt and trying to get them the help they need so that their children can succeed in the educational system, so that they can move into the employment system more effectively, so that they can live with basic human dignity. That would be an equity approach. Let's get these people the things we need. In my view, justice occurs when you don't have to do that, because the difference between black and white people in terms of income is like the difference between people with, different length fingernails or some other arbitrary characteristic. That you no longer live in a society where you can pull up a map of lead toxicity and guess what the racial composition of those neighborhoods is. So that's what we're talking about in terms of justice. It's like getting to a place where we don't have to give more resources to 63106 because it's a thriving community. Is that even slightly responsive to your question? So equity is, we got a problem, let's try and get more resources where we need them. And justice is, hey, we no longer have a problem. That's why I agree with you. I think the image of the fence is a little confusing because the people are still different heights, and I think the metaphor breaks down a little bit. I didn't like that myself. You're welcome.
Hi, thank you for sharing all of this. It's kind of a half-baked question, so bear with me. I think I'm just curious, so I think, can you go back to the solutions slide, I think, or the study that you had highlighted in red? I think a lot of them, the solutions were around, directly challenging poverty and having anti-poverty policy solutions as the real driver behind changing racially inequitable outcomes. So I'm wondering due to the fact that all those solutions are not inherently under the house of CPS, I'm curious if that begs questions for you or your field as to the entire efficacy of CPS as an institution. If the real solutions are happening outside of CPS, how does that make CPS still a viable entity to actually protect children?
Well, you can't, CPS can be thought of sort of like an ambulance. The best way to deal with whatever the injury or illness that the ambulance is responding to is to get rid of it in society in general. But it ain't gotten rid of, so we still need an ambulance. So when a 14-year-old girl is being molested and needs protection, someone's got to do that. So you still need the CPS. There's what I call the Ghostbusters question. Who are you going to call? Well, don't call CPS, call law enforcement. Is that really what they want? So one answer is CPS, you need to have an entity that can respond to emergent crises, and you need to think about who you want doing that. The other thing I would say is, you're right, CPS cannot fix poverty, but at least CPS can be as sensitive and helpful as possible to the toxin of poverty within the people it serves. And what I mean by the toxin of poverty is, poverty isn't just being poor, it's also not being able to get to your court date maybe, because if you're working for an agency that will fire you if you miss one day of work. So I would say that CPS, while it can't fix poverty, maybe it can set itself a goal of doing an excellent job buffering those negative effects within the people it serves to the best it can. Again, like trauma-informed services. How do I think about everything in this agency? Is it more frightening in any way? Is the receptionist someone who's very gentle and kind in their demeanor? All those things. I'd like to see an awareness of poverty infused throughout every kind of social service we provide.
For me, I think the issue is we have agreed the article we have about poverty is explaining only, at least that's what we have, explaining 20%. It's still, that's the best we have, am I right? At least that's the best we present.
Poverty probably, if you could get rid of poverty, you would almost certainly stop most child maltreatment, and you might stop 4/5 of it.
But we don't know, am I right?
We don't know, but we do know that, for example, neglect, which is the most common kind of child maltreatment, is overrepresented 9-to-1 among the poor.
Yeah, so I think for me, maybe the argument poverty among, I would think about a very multidimensional approach, which really, so emphasizing poverty poses those kinds of questions. So if we know poverty, why is it that we are not doing something about it in that, CPS, whatever it may be? So I think for me, the argument was plus.
Oh, I agree completely.
Otherwise, I think that someone may listen and say, yeah, but poverty, the best we have, other than we may, but the best, at least the best that was presented, it's explained 20%. Now, unless we get something else that can scientifically show that, look here, it really took away 80% or 60% or whatever it may be, then I think we could elevate poverty as the primary. But I think that we should really be thinking about this in terms of a multidimensional approach, poverty being one of the things that should be addressed, plus.
Could not agree more. Examples include reducing teen pregnancy, which we've actually been doing fairly well at. Some European nations have had some luck around changing societal norms around things like corporal punishment. So absolutely, I'm not saying it's only poverty. It just so happens that where the data are, that's kind of the stream of evidence that's kind of been burning through most robustly over the past couple of decades.
So I'm really sorry to ask another question, Brett. And like what I do, it's interesting. Poverty matters a lot in a lot of those domains, no matter what area we touch. But it's interesting that Matt Kruder and I talk about all the time. Education is the great elixir, because when you can have people that are quote unquote low income or poor or impoverished, but if they have a higher degree of education, it's like there's a tipping point with education where certain behaviors, irrespective of your income, change. So do you see that with education as a moderator or as an interaction with income? And if you haven't assessed that, I'd be really interested in helping statistics there.
So the Rolling Stones will helpfully inform you that you can't always get what you want. And we don't have those data we don't have that in national data. We simply don't have it. And you're absolutely right. So I've sold my soul a little bit to be able to give you national data by accepting the limitations of the national data. And so that's a real problem with us.
We only have 1 minute left.
Okay, so
Time is the last question.
okay, last question from Dr. Edmond.
I'm going to take it in a hypothetical situation rather than and thank you for this presentation. It was really great, Brett. But in all the headlines right now are really focused on AI. We have some expertise in our school in AI in the child welfare system. A lot of what I'm reading about AI is the profound loss of jobs that are anticipated to be taken over by automation, which, as we know, will have the most adverse consequences on the poorest people in our communities. So can you, because I know you're a big proponent of big data, but can you talk about the tensions in this space for child welfare?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Certainly anything that puts downward pressure on the ability of families to have the resources they need to lead a dignified life is something we really, really, really need to be concerned about. So yeah, I mean, I have no idea what the future holds in terms of employment as a function of AI. The hopeful part of me says, well, when we invented sewing machines, we just were able to make more clothes. So maybe our society will become more productive and there'll be other wonderful jobs for those people. I really don't know anything about this in terms of what the future is going to hold. But no, I agree. I'm also terrified. If there is a real inability of people to earn a dignified living, I think that's very bad for my field. There's also a whole hot set of topics around AI and doing things like screening in child protective services. And if you want to learn more about that, I would refer you to the work of Emily Putnam-Hornstein or Rima Viathanian from New Zealand. Or I would have you look at the Allegheny work that's being done in Allegheny County, where they've been using some AI to try and improve their screening of child protective services. So if you have an interest in sort of the more direct application to CPS, you could look at some of those sources.
All right, let's thank Brett for his talk one more time. Thank you, and feel free to tell us some biscotti on the way out.
Yay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.